Now, I found myself thinking this week about milk delivery. Like, I know this might seem like a strange thing, but so when I was a kid, I grew up in the Blue Mountains, we still got milk delivered in glass bottles. I don't even know when that ended. When did that end in Canberra? I don't know. But I feel like, how did we let that go? Like, that was amazing. You know, I still remember it. These guys would literally drive down the street, the back of the van would be open, they would run with bottles, glass bottles full of milk, and drop them at your door a number of times a week. Like, what happened? Why did we just sort of, I know, it's going to be easier if I go to the supermarket and lug it all back myself. What a mistake. I think it was cheaper, but I still think it was a mistake. But I remember those bottles, and I remember them particularly because my mother, and I don't mean to embarrass her, but I will, she used to, every time a new bottle of milk would come out, she would shake it quite vigorously. Some of you may know, may have the same habit. And as a kid, I always used to think, what are you doing? Why are you shaking the milk? Because they used to have these flimsy, kind of foil caps. I always thought it was a very risky endeavour. And she would say, I'm mixing in the cream. And when I was quite young, I learned about homogenization. Like, you don't need to do that anymore. I'm sorry if you're still doing this. Apparently, you don't need to shake the milk to mix through the cream. But my mum, had done it, obviously, her whole life, and she may still do it, I'm not sure. But it was just so ingrained that she saw no reason, really, to change. And I think it's really interesting, these moments in life where you encounter someone who you assume kind of lives their life in much the same way that you do, but they do it really differently. And wrong. The way they do it is wrong. I remember once staying with a friend of mine and seeing her, she was hanging out washing, in her backyard. And again, I'm going to offend people here possibly, but she would hang out the washing in a way that kind of economized on pegs, right? So she, you're hanging your t-shirt, and then she would put the next garment overlapping with the same peg, if that makes sense. Now, if you do that, I respect you, it's fine. In my household, this was akin to a crime. If my father came out and found out that I'd hung the washing like that, I would, what are you doing? The corners aren't going to dry. It's not going to work. So I'm sure it's the kind of thing that raises strong. But it is a strange thing. I sort of realised that she was right. It actually dries just fine if you do it that way, because I have lived in many share houses where pegs were a precious commodity. But it was this strange kind of encounter of seeing someone who you assumed would do this thing in the correct, the normal, the appropriate way, and they do it wrong. If you live with a significant other, maybe you encountered this when you got married. If you have adult children, perhaps you've seen that your children have strange and terrible ways of doing things that are kind of an affront to the way that you raise them. But it is a kind of a strange experience. Now, this passage that we've heard from the St. Paul's first letter to the Corinthians, I think is carving a path through one of these kind of encounters. But it's one where the stakes are much higher than a sort of an unnecessary milk bottle shake or an inefficient peg placement. So I want to spend most of our time there this morning. There is much richness in our gospel reading, but I'm going to spend most of our time in this 1 Corinthians 8. So I know we've had a few readings from 1 Corinthians over the last few weeks in the lectionary, so forgive me if I'm kind of covering unnecessary ground. 1 Corinthians has been described, the commentator Richard Hayes, he says it is like reading someone else's mail. So, and you can kind of see it in the passage. You see there's a few times where the translators have put certain phrases or sentences in quote marks. And the idea that what most sort of scholars think is that what's happened is Paul started this church in Corinth, in Greece. He started the church around about AD 50. There's a bit of debate about this. He spent 18 months there, and then he left. And then subsequently, there was a kind of correspondence between him and the communities back in Corinth. And basically, the church in Corinth, if you've spent much time reading this book, you'll know the church in Corinth was a bit of a mess. It was kind of riven by factions. People were kind of just stumbling along trying to work out how to live out their faith, but it was a real mess. And so it seems what happened is that a group of people within the church, Chloe's people, they seem to be called, so it was possibly that one of the church communities in Corinth met in Chloe's house and they were sort of a group. They sent Paul a letter with a bunch of concerns and questions. And so in this passage, when you see Paul kind of quoting, we think he's kind of quoting their letter. So as he's writing, he's reflecting on the questions or the arguments that they've made to him. And so there's been a bunch of questions addressed so far. There's questions about sexual immorality, about marriage. It goes on to these questions about spiritual gifts and worship. There's a whole bunch of issues. But chapter 8, and basically chapters 8, 9 and 10 are sort of an extended exploration of this question that the Corinthians have about whether or not it is okay to eat food that has been sacrificed to idols. Now I know this is the issue that has been keeping you awake all week. You know, like, is this appropriate or not? Now I kind of say this, I think the reality is that probably for many of us in 21st century Australia, this is not something that we've ever worried about. It's not something that's really ever given us pause. It's not something I think about a great deal, but I think actually for many Christians around the world, even today, probably even for many in Australia, this is a live issue actually, trying to work out, even on the very specific question of whether to eat food that has been offered or kind of dedicated to different deities and that kind of question. So it's still a real thing for people all around the world. But for the Corinthians, this was a huge problem. It was a real hot button issue in the church. Basically, in first century Corinth, if you walk down the street, what you would be struck by is a remarkable amount of temples, of statues of different gods and goddesses, and attached to those temples were sort of enormous dining halls. And often they were sort of the function venues at the time, so people would literally have their birthday. They would say, oh, we're going to have our birthday at Artemis's temple, get into it. And so people would kind of come, gather at Artemis's temple, and there would be a ritual, a sacrifice to the goddess, and then you would eat the food from that sacrifice. It was just a really kind of common part of everyday life in the Greco-Roman world. And so, for Christians in the first century, they were kind of faced with this question in a reasonably common, straightforward way. Is it appropriate to eat food that has been dedicated to another god or goddess? And what was happening, it seems, that in the church at Corinth, you had some people who were essentially saying, guys, this is absolutely fine. Like, what are you worried about? We know that there's only one God. What does it matter if it's been kind of part of this ritual? You know, these are our friends. We are going to go to the party at Artemis's temple. It's fine. Then you've got other people in the community who are saying, no, this is wrong. This is actually a spiritually dangerous thing for us to do. We don't want to be caught up in this system of worship or of religious practice that is really alien to what we believe. And so this question actually ended up touching on these really significant issues in the community. It was basically a question about the boundaries between the church and the surrounding culture. How do you interact with the world around you? I think, and a lot of commentators kind of suggest that actually there was a class dimension to this as well. So it was actually the wealthier, connected people in the church who were the ones who got invited to these parties at the pagan temples. The kind of more working class, the slaves in the community, they would not have eaten meat very regularly at all. So for them, this wasn't so much a part of their experience, and they may have been more scandalized by the wealthier members of their church who they would see, chowing down in the pagan temples. So it was about the class kind of boundaries within the church itself. And then finally, it was about the relationship between knowledge and love. And so that's why I think, even though that I think for many of us, this issue of whether or not to eat food sacrificed to idols, in contemporary Australia, we just don't even have the same thing in exactly the same way. Even though that issue might seem a little arcane and unfamiliar, I think some of these questions about how we interact with the world around us, how we deal with the differences and kind of deep convictions of our brothers and sisters within the Christian community who might think really differently to us on really key issues of everyday life and deeper things. And then how do we relate knowledge and love? I think actually these are things that for all of us are really live questions. So, what does Paul say? It's kind of interesting. In Acts 15, this question of whether or not you could eat food sacrificed to idols, it kind of came to the apostles in Jerusalem, sort of the central governing body of the church at the time. There was a big council, they discussed it, and they sent out a letter to all the Christians in the world and basically said, don't do it. Don't eat food sacrificed to idols. It was given a blanket ban. But Paul doesn't just sort of repeat the ban in a straightforward way. He actually kind of goes into quite some depth into the question. And so his response, I think, is actually kind of interesting. Reading between the lines, it seems that the letter writers, the people who had written to Paul from Chloe's household, thought that they were on pretty solid ground. They're the ones who were saying, look, we all possess knowledge. There's only one God. Idols don't really exist. It's surely fine to eat this food. And I think they might have been expecting that Paul would say, you guys are right. Absolutely. No worries at all. But in fact, Paul is much more interested in changing the hearts of those strong, knowledgeable, those who thought themselves spiritually mature, than the people who are very scrupulous and are worried about the idol food. And it's kind of interesting, right? So some years ago, I don't know if you saw this, and this kind of thing comes up periodically. There was a big brouhaha in South Africa because one of the major supermarket chains produced a bunch of hot cross buns, like it made hot cross buns that were halal certified, right? And so this became, and that actually doesn't mean, just to be clear, that doesn't mean that being sacrificed, in a religious ritual. It simply meant that the ingredients of the hot cross buns were fine for Muslims to eat, right? But it meant that a certain kind of group of people in South Africa saw this and freaked out. Christians freaked out. They're like, what are you doing? We can't eat these hot cross buns. It became this kind of a big fuss, and it was in the news, right? And it was the kind of thing, and, depending on where you kind of fall on this kind of thing, it's the kind of thing that often you see and you're just like, oh, guys, I think you've totally misunderstood what this is about. You're kind of embarrassing me by being, kind of whipping up, and you can feel, even you think, come on, this is so unloving, surely you want to make hot cross buns that Muslims can eat. Surely it's fine. But it's so interesting because it's almost as if Paul, if he was writing in that situation, he might be saying, yes, look, it's fine. I'm not worried about the halal certification on the hot cross buns. But the people I'm most concerned about are the people who are looking down on their brothers and sisters who are upset about this. It's the people who are very smug and feel, well, I'm the kind of progressive, well-researched, intelligent person who knows that it's fine to eat this idol food. They're the ones that Paul is challenging, which is kind of confronting. I think probably if I was in that kind of first century church, who knows what it would have been like, I could imagine that I would have been one of the people saying, oh, for goodness sake, what does it matter? I'll have a, Artemis sacrifice steak. What's the problem? I worship one God. All things are from God. It doesn't matter. And Paul would be saying, slow down. You may actually be right, that there's nothing actually in this food that's going to hurt you. The food is not defiled. It's given to you by God. But your attitude to your brothers and sisters who are kind of stressed about this, who are anxious about this, is actually, I'm sort of more worried about that than their perhaps over-scrupulous approach to this food, which is quite striking. And Paul kind of talks about this in quite strong terms. If you look in verse 11, he says he's kind of imagining a scenario where the knowledgeable, the people who are quite comfortable with eating food in these pagan temples, the knowledgeable are kind of doing their thing, they're feasting, and their brothers and sisters from the Christian community who actually feel that this is inappropriate behaviour see them and I kind of think, oh well, I guess it's fine. They go to the temple and they eat this food. Whereas for them, they actually feel that they are participating in this kind of religious practice. They feel that they are honouring these gods by their behaviour. And so Paul says actually, by the knowledgeable, by those who are kind of relaxed and comfortable about this, by leading them into a situation, you have wounded their conscience. He even uses the word destroyed their conscience. And this is so striking. Like in verse 11, he says, so by your knowledge, which is true, he says, yeah, it's true. It's fine, the food's fine. By your knowledge, those weak believers for whom Christ died are destroyed. And when you thus sin against members of your family and wound their conscience when it is weak, you sin against Christ. It's pretty heavy, right? Like he's ramping it up there. And I just think it is so striking that even though he spent the first part of the passage saying, you guys, the strong, the knowledgeable, you're essentially right on one level. The food is food. The idols are not, gods. There's no real problem on one level. But he's saying if you're willing to use that knowledge to be smug and superior and draw your brothers and sisters into a space where they feel uncomfortable and are drawn away from Christ, then you have sinned against them. This is not what your knowledge is for. So, what does that mean for us? I think it can be a bit complicated. I think sometimes a passage like this can be used in a way that it's not quite intended. So, for example, sometimes it can be wielded by the most scrupulous members of a community against everyone else, if that makes sense. And you may have experienced this in different Christian contexts. I've definitely experienced it. Someone has a very strong feeling, no one should read Harry Potter, for example. This is a thing. And so we take them out of the school library because we don't want anyone to read it. Sorry, again, no offense if anyone has done that in the past. I respect it, but that it's a strong position. So you do that, and then everyone else is then kind of has to live with what the most scrupulous people feel. But actually, what Paul is challenging is that these people, the people who are kind of pretty casual about the idol feasts and that kind of thing, they are the strongest, the most powerful people in the community. And so it's a challenge really to those who are strong in how they use their power. And so often, if you've got someone who's scrupulous and strong, they kind of use their strength against everyone else. Whereas I don't think that's actually what Paul's really getting at. He's saying that if you are in a position of power in a church community, use that for the good of those around you. Which doesn't mean you have to, if you feel very strongly, actually, we can have difference of opinions about the appropriateness of Harry Potter, for example. That can be okay. I don't know if that makes sense, but I think this passage, I think, can be sometimes used in that way. But I think the truth is that there are things that as Christians we have every right to do. They're not a sin, they're not an inappropriate thing to do as Christians, which we will, on occasion, need to abstain from for the sake of others. And I've experienced this in ways that I still feel like quite, I feel uncomfortable about even still. So for a couple of years I lived in South Africa, about 10 years ago. And in the particular church culture I was in, it's kind of complicated, but in some church cultures in South Africa, Christians didn't drink alcohol. It was really almost an article of faith. It was very strongly held that it was inappropriate for Christians to drink. And in many communities, alcoholism and alcohol abuse was really rife, and so it was quite a reasonable position to take. I was fairly comfortable drinking alcohol, and so in some circles, if I was with people who sort of shared my convictions and were kind of comfortable with moderate alcohol use, I would have a drink. But then in other contexts, I wouldn't, right? I was living this sort of, two-track kind of life. I wouldn't have told anyone, I wouldn't have been in one context, I should never drink and then drink. I just sort of kept quiet about it in those contexts. Then I remember one day, I think I'd left a packet, a wrapper from a six-pack or something in the back of my car. And some of the university students who I was working with got in. And were like, what's this? And they were horrified that someone in ministry would be drinking. To them, it was this real kind of well, we thought you were a Christian and you're doing it, And I was like, well, actually, Jesus turned water into the wine. It doesn't matter. In that context, I think I let those guys down. I let them down because I was using a freedom which I think I could justify and I still feel comfortable with. But I think probably if I was going to work with people who felt really strongly about it, that was something I could give up. That was something I could do without. I think this is what this passage is pushing us to. Is our primary motivation about love? So, I want to finish actually where it starts, right near the front of right at the beginning of the passage, because I think what Paul says in these first 3 verses is really striking and is actually at the heart of the whole message. So he says, now concerning food sacrificed to idols, we know that all of us possess knowledge. That's quoting them. Yeah, we all possess knowledge. We know that this is, idols are nothing. Then he says, knowledge puffs up, but love builds up. Anyone who claims to know something does not yet have the necessary knowledge. But anyone who loves God is known by him. Now, what is so striking about this is that as you follow it, you would expect that Paul's going to say, anyone who claims to know something does not yet have the necessary knowledge, but anyone who loves God knows God. Like, that's what you sort of expect him to say. But instead, it says, anyone who loves God is known by him. And I think what Paul is hinting at, in this quite kind of subtle way in some ways, is he's saying, you need to remember that actually before any of this, before we even existed, God knew us. We exist because of God and we exist for God. Anything we might think that we know, any kind of sense of, of superiority that we carry through life, it's a mistake if we're leading with that. Because fundamentally we are people who are known by God and loved by God before anything else. And so how dare you, he's saying to me and to all of us, how dare you use something you think you know, and you may even be right about, as a weapon against people who God knows and God loves, and God calls you to love. That, I think, is the challenge for us as we navigate these complicated kind of issues. And I don't think there's any really easy answers. I think for us as Christians, we have many questions about how we navigate the surrounding culture. Are there social practices we should withdraw from that are kind of hurting us and hurting others? I think it's a very difficult question. How intertwined should the life of the church be with the wider life of the nation? These are tough questions. But I think we will navigate them well if we find ourselves in the place where Paul encourages us to be. If love for one another, love for those among us who are struggling, who are vulnerable, who are weak, in this sense that he speaks. If that is our primary focus, I think we'll be served well as we navigate the complexities of these kind of questions. So in the name of God, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen.